All right, guys, thank you for joining us for another true crime, myths, legends, and more. Uh, Thank you for checking out all the other episodes and following us along. We currently have, this is episode number 4. So we have 3 previous to this. And as we record this, only 2 of them are released. So we just had our episode with E.J. Hammond. That came out just today. So if you guys are looking to go and see like how far out I do these things, it's the 15th today when it came out. So, but EJ Hammond is up there live, us talking about Bundy. If you haven't had a chance yet, make sure you check out that interview with Willis Morgan, where we talk about Dahmer and Hollywood, Florida. And tonight we have our very, very first doctor here with us, which is incredible. Like, I feel like we're getting smarter every time we do one of these episodes. It's good. We have Dr. Mark Hewitt with us tonight, who is a Zodiac expert, has written several books. Actually, he has a brand new one that just came out. And it's funny because we've been like Facebook friends for some time. And I saw it because the new book came out. And I was like, ooh, you know who would be a good guest is Dr. Hewitt. So I hit him up and he was more than happy to come on and talk to us. For those of you that have had a chance to check out my book, Beyond the Headlines, you know that there is a chapter in there devoted to the Zodiac where we cover several different theories. But we didn't cover this theory. So I'll be really, really interested to talk to Dr. Hewitt about all of the things and all of the background of what he believes to be the case and who the Zodiac actually is. But he has put out 3 different books, the Zodiac Serial Killer series. The first one is Hunted. Then you have Profiled, Exposed, and the newest book is called Obsessed. And that is about his lifetime of looking into this case and researching it and all the things that have encompassed. So with that being said, we're going to bring Mark Hewitt to the stage right now. Hey, how's it going?
Hey, Jeff. I'm doing well, thank you. I appreciate you having me on your show.
Absolutely. It's fantastic, man. It's always good to talk to somebody that, has done so much research and has really looked into everything and looked into all of these things. I know when I was writing Beyond the Headlines, one of my favorite things is, and of course now they always get me because I always want to say things off the cuff and then I forget names when I'm doing that because they don't automatically pop into my brain. So the chapter I wrote on Bundy, oh my goodness. And Kevin Sullivan. There we go. I always get it eventually. But Kevin actually did a bunch of the proofreading for the book. And of course, he is a Bundy expert, one of the foremost Bundy experts out there. And he got to read it and give me a bunch of feedback on all of the stuff that I wrote about Bundy. And it was a really, really cool experience to have somebody that has literally studied one single thing, or I mean, he studied many things, but one specific thing and knows the ins and outs of all of the trials, all of the letters, everything that's happened. And it was cool to get that kind of stamp of approval on some of the things that I wrote and that I did. So it's been really kind of neat to do that. And it's neat to talk to you. So yeah, how long have you been researching all of this?
Well, my intensive research into the Zodiac dates back to 2006, 2007, when I decided to stop dabbling in it and actually set goals of digging as deeply as I possibly could into the case. And it was at that time I decided that I was going to read all the FBI and police profiles that I could get my hands on, read every book published on the case, and talk to as many people as I was able to do. And that began my relentless journey into the Zodiac world.
Wow. So So you said that that's when you decided to get really serious about it. Like, what happened before then that got you interested in this whole genre to begin with?
Well, I first came in contact with the Zodiac case back in the 80s. A friend recommended I read Graysmith's book, and the story really fascinated me. But I felt it was solved because Graysmith basically said it was solved, that Arthur Lee Allen was responsible. And over the years, I saw a number of documentaries and talked to different people about the case. And the more I found out about the case, the more I wanted to know more details, and the more I started to wonder whether Arthur Lee Allen really was interested, was responsible for all of the murders. And so back in 2005, 2006, I was reading about it and dabbling in it. I even spent a couple hours working on the Z340 code of the Zodiac. And I came to a point where I realized, either I have to throw myself in this completely, or I have to back away from it because it was taking up a lot of time.
Yeah.
And I didn't want it to be a hobby that just pulled me away from life, but didn't really produce anything. And so I made the decision at that time to throw myself in. I had no interest. I had no thought that I was going to be writing about the case. No, I didn't know where my journey would lead. Actually, I had two ideas of what I thought was going to happen. I thought I was going to confirm that Arthur Lee Allen was responsible because so many people and so much information seemed to point to him. Or else I was going to figure out that it was some person who maybe lost to history. I'd never know who it was, but I'd get to know his personality a little bit and be able to kind of understand his psychology a little bit better.
So that's one of the things that's always been fascinating to me when it comes to the world of true crime, and why I've always been so fascinated is the psychology aspect of it. I've always wanted to understand, not necessarily, like, a lot of people come to it and they want to know why. And that's never really been the question for me. But I wanted to understand the line of thinking. Like, how do people come to this? Not because I think that it's not something that's much more common than we'd like to believe, because I think we all have thoughts of murdering other people and doing horrible things. Most of us don't follow through with those things, but we certainly all are guilty of having thoughts. So I think it's fascinating. I know myself, I've talked about this a little bit, not so much on the podcast yet because it hasn't really come up. But I struggled with a lot of the same things that I see, the psychological behaviors in lots of these killers. So it's been fascinating, very cathartic for me to be able to jump into the headspace and to understand them better and to understand where they're coming from. So that was always a big push for me. And I, like you, have always, studying bits and pieces of the Zodiac case here and there, have always kind of drawn more towards Arthur Lee Allen because there is a lot of things that point in that direction. But ultimately, it's difficult unless you're really, really digging in. And there's there's all kinds of other things. When I was writing the chapter on the Zodiac, I'm trying to think, and you'll know who I'm talking about, but there is a website. What is that gentleman's name? I can't think of his name now. But
ZodiacKiller.com.
Yeah. That website. What's the guy's name that created that?
Tom, I believe.
Yeah, and he has compiled information, and not just like from all kinds of theories on who the Zodiac could possibly be. Some that are obviously complete bunk, but it's nice to see an area where you could really look and start the beginning of really digging in and understanding all of the intricacies of the case. So yeah, I think it's fascinating. And I'm curious, and maybe this is for later on, but this is going to come out after the new documentary hits. There's a new one on Netflix that's getting ready to come out. This is the Zodiac Speaking, is the name of the documentary. It comes out October 23rd, and it is directly pointing to Arthur Lee Allen. and they're now saying that there is new evidence that they've come out with that directly points to him. So I don't know if you know anything about the background of that show that's getting ready to come out or not.
I know a little bit. I'm friends with one of the participants who will be filmed in the show, and she's not really happy with what they've done with her words and what they've done with the whole matter. She is convinced that it's not Arthur Lee Allen, and so she was never told that the series was going to point to Arthur Lee Allen, and I think she may have had hesitancy to get involved if that was the conclusion that they were going to draw. But as I say, I haven't seen it yet, but I'm planning on seeing it next week when it comes out.
Yeah, I will be watching it for sure because, I mean, as one of the people that probably ingests as much as every other middle-aged woman in the country is ingesting, I'm right there with them on the couch watching all the shows and enjoying every minute of it. I think I talked about this actually in a paranormal show that I just did. And I think it's fascinating that we have this idea that Netflix and Hulu and Peacock and all these media outlets have the most honest documentaries out there, right? They do their best to skew it in the way that they think is going to give them the most views and that is going to be the most successful for their own network, not necessarily airing the truth and the whole truth. And a lot of the reason for my book was because I wanted people to understand that. I wanted intentionally to be ambiguous so that people could dig in more, so that they could use those critical thinking skills, so that they could start here and now really find out all of the information, which is why I love talking to people like you, because you've done that further work. And now people can go and look at the stuff that you've done and investigate that and look at the validity and see what is there. And that is incredible. But yeah, God, there's no less than 12 documentaries out there, recent ones on the Zodiac. And it has been a fascinating story, mainly because the Zodiac's never been identified, right? So
Correct.
people are constantly interested. It's the same reason why we're so fascinated with Jack the Ripper, right? Jack the Ripper has stood the test of time, getting close to, 200 years now. That case is still out there because we have no idea who Jack the Ripper actually was. People have lots and lots of theories, but in the case of Jack the Ripper, we're never going to know. Like, it's impossible. There's no DNA. Everything that they could possibly have is so degraded. And, nobody knew to keep things, back in that time. So, it's not something that we're ever really going to know, no matter what Patricia Cornwall says and writes in her books. But, we're not going to know that. So this is an interesting case because it's closer, right? It's not, it's in some of our lifetimes, not mine. So what do you think about the documentaries that are actually out there currently?
Well, first let me respond to your Jack the Ripper comment. I'd be careful not to say never, because, you never know what technology is going to come around the corner. And
that's true.
People recently were saying that about the Golden State Killer. They'll never catch him. It's been too long ago. And boom, one day there's a press conference and we know who he is.
Yeah.
And I've heard a lot of people say that about the Zodiac as well. We'll never know. There's no way we can find out now. There's not enough information. I would never bet against future technology. Who knows what can be invented? I'm looking forward to the day where we can get the announcement of a press conference and find out the results of the case, but we'll see if that happens or not. With respect to the documentaries that have come out, the people who put them together are not necessarily Zodiac experts. Sometimes they rely on one expert or another expert and do the best they can, as you say. their goal is first and foremost entertainment. They need
Right.
clicks, they need viewers. And so the more that they can hype it up, the better for them. The more they can make it focus on one theory, and the more they can hype it up that they've solved it because this theory is absolutely correct and they can prove it, the more people are going to show up. So I have a lot of friends who say, oh, don't bother with those. Those are really stupid. And they criticize everyone that comes out. I take the view that it's better that we have these shows because it puts more people in tune with the case, gets more eyeballs on it, and many more people start to look into the case and say, gee, are these facts correct? Or what is the truth? And so on Reddit and Facebook and half a dozen websites, there are people continuing to wrestle with the details of the case. And every new documentary that comes out, it brings more people in asking questions about the Zodiac. I consider it the greatest unsolved criminal mystery in the United States.
Yeah.
Other people say John Benet Ramsey or any other number of unsolved cases in the United States, but I think the Zodiac has garnered more attention than any of the other cases.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right when it comes to the wealth of documentaries that are out there. Good or bad, it's all information, and it's one of those things. Like, if you're really going to dig into these things and you're going to dig into the cases themselves, we need all of the information, right? So each one of them, even though they may not be honest in their conclusions, are giving bits and pieces of this information. And I think it's important to look at all of that stuff and see, what is this? Why does it make sense? Does it make sense? Is it way out there? And I think more information is always better. Yeah, I like, for example, the most recent documentary that's already out was The Myth of the Zodiac, right? That came out on Peacock, I think about a year or so ago. That one, for me, sitting down and watching that was fascinating, mainly because it was a theory that I never even considered before, right? So it was not a theory. Like, I always thought, well, there's a Zodiac for sure. And Thomas Horan is the guy who is the main protagonist for that. And he kind of came up with this idea that there was no Zodiac at all. That that the letters weren't written by, only the first 4 letters may have even been written by the same person, and there were many, many other letters, and that that the crime scenes didn't fit, that there was only one person there. And so I thought it was interesting. And I thought that they did a good job in that documentary for the most part, with also giving the other side of that, right? And they brought in other experts that refuted that, even though they obviously had an agenda out there. But it was nice that they at least put that together. And there were people on there that said this is completely crazy. So, but what are your thoughts about that?
Mine are very similar to yours. It was an interesting documentary. It was well worth watching and thinking about the case. When people start getting involved in the Zodiac case, one of the first things they say is, well, maybe there were 2 people, one person who did the killing and somebody else who did the writing, and that's why this person was never caught. Horn has taken it to the next step. There was no Zodiac. It was a bunch of murders that had been committed for a variety of different reasons, and then somebody or some group of people or a variety of people taking credit for them in letters. The problem with that theory is that the FBI has said all the canonical letters, the letters that we know of that are Zodiac letters, were done by the same hand. It's not something that somebody could just fake and somebody write a couple letters and then somebody a few years later pick up on it and start using the same handwriting again. It was the same handwriting. And on top of that, the letter writer took great pains to prove that he was involved in all of these killings. He brought pieces of Paul Stein's shirt tail and deposited them in a couple of letters. He gave information that was only known to him and the police. The logical conclusion, if somebody is saying, I'm going to prove that I am the Zodiac, I'm the one who did these things, and then gives all this information and material, the most logical conclusion is that, yes, it was the person who did that. And some of the wrong information that he gave, there's reasons why it was wrong, and that actually adds to its authenticity rather than being exactly precise. So the idea that there were more than one killers, or that there was more than one writer, or that they weren't the same person, doesn't really fit with an analysis of all of the details of the case.
Yeah. And, you know, I think it's amazing. You have a very similar thing that happens again with Jack the Ripper, right? And the half of kidney that he ends up sending with one of the letters. And, you know, the Zodiac, interestingly enough, there are some parallels with the way that things were written, the interaction between the police and the Zodiac. And then later on, we see that again. And this is actually something that I covered in the book. But Dennis Rader uses some similar things in the way that he contacts the police. And there is actually a theory out there that Rader was the Zodiac. And people know this, but he is the only killer that I actually talk to from time to time. And so when I was writing the book, me and Dennis were talking about, you know, I asked him some things that he might want me to include. And I said, and I don't know if you know anything about the book, but I cover 3 myths and a legend about each killer. So the whole idea is there's a lot of these people that become almost mythological figures in our society for whatever reason. All of these things rise up about them and their origins and where they came from and what happened. And some of them are true. Some of them are complete bullshit. And so I wanted to really bring that out and to show these little details and to talk about them. And so when I talked to Dennis, I asked him what he wanted me to put in there as his legend, right? And he wanted me to cover the theory that he was the Zodiac. So I cover that in the very last portion of the book. And of course, we pretty well know that it's not true. Even if
so
he was
confessing, he was saying
no,
that is legend. That's obviously not true.
Yes.
Okay.
And so he has been questioned 4 times by the FBI regarding the Zodiac case.
No kidding.
Yeah, and so he asked me to include that, and I thought it was interesting. There is actually a book out there that I ended up getting into called Zodiac Settling the Score by Kimberly McGath, and she is the one that really purported that theory that Rader was the Zodiac. And so I kind of quote her book a little bit in there and, you know, kind of go through some of the evidence that she said and then say why it's probably not correct at all. But I have a lot of fun doing that. Well, and then you have the other more recent one is the book and then the documentary as well, The Most Dangerous Animal of All. And I thought that one was interesting. I thought the documentary itself, the way that they structured it, they really did a really great job of like proving his case and then immediately destroying the case.
It was brilliant. It was brilliant. Yeah. You couldn't write a Greek tragedy better than that one. It was fantastic.
Yeah, if you guys out there have not seen that documentary, I don't know why you haven't, but it is incredible. They will have you believe that Earl Van Best Jr. is the Zodiac without a doubt in those first 2 episodes. And then when you watch episode 3, you're like, oh, that was all bullshit. It's amazing that they do a great job of it.
I watched that when it first came out, when it was first on television. I got together with 6 Zodiac friends and we watched through it. And I was getting so frustrated for the first 3 episodes. There are 4 episodes to it. I think 4 1-hour episodes, or is it 4 half-hour episodes?
No, I think they were an hour. Yeah.
So we watched the whole thing straight through, and I was getting frustrated because they were focusing on certain things that shouldn't be focused on, and they were saying things that weren't necessarily true or a little bit shaded. As you said, part of bringing out we proved this guy is responsible. And just when I thought that it was going to be a really trashy, horrible documentary, partway through the 3rd episode, they began to surgically take apart everything that they had said, and they basically eviscerated the author of that book and made him look like a conniving, scheming, money-hungry person who would lie about his mother to earn some bucks.
Yeah.
And it came out very clearly that evidence had been tampered with, evidence had been forged. There were certain misunderstandings. A handwriting expert was paid to say what he wanted said, and the document didn't even originate from the Zodiac, or the document that they used to compare didn't even come from the suspect that was being proposed. So by the end of it, everybody was just saying, yeah, somebody got their just due for trying to make some money on a book. I enjoyed the book. I thought it was a fascinating story of a guy who made contact with his birth father, tried to find out about his history, because I guess he was dropped off somewhere in a basket and didn't know who his original parents were. He ended up finding out who they were. But then there were a couple of chapters pasted on at the end about the Zodiac that really had nothing to do with his personal story of finding his birth father, because there was no good evidence that his birth father had anything to do with the Zodiac. I think it's a combination of he wanted his birth father to be the Zodiac, or even if he maybe thought it was the Zodiac, but maybe he needed to pad the evidence a little bit to make it more convincing to people who wouldn't understand. I don't know exactly. I can't look into his heart, but you were left at the end of the documentary very unsatisfied with the theory that he was putting forward. At the same time, it got more people looking at the Zodiac case, so that's a good thing.
For sure. And I have the book over on my shelf on the other side of the room. And you know, it's funny. I don't know if you experience this, but I certainly do. Since I wrote a book, now I find myself going to bookstores and I end up looking at covers more than anything else. And I'm like, damn, that is a great cover. And the book, The Most Dangerous Animal of All, has an incredible cover. Whoever came up with that, it's like a lenticular cover. It's like clear. The book, the dust jacket, and I'm like, wow, that is an incredible cover for a book. And you know, when you end up being somebody who is publishing books and stuff, it's a huge selling point. Like, people buy books because they look pretty, right? They want to put them up on the wall. It's not always about what's inside of them. So
It's just buyer beware.
Yeah. So it just always makes me laugh when I see stuff like that. But I just recently picked that up at a bookstore because I wanted to read it and go through it, because I haven't read it yet. I've watched the documentary, but have not read the book. I know a couple years ago, there was a big like media thing that came out where a group of people had gotten together and they apparently or they said that they had solved the final cipher, and they came out with a name, and it seemed like all of that stuff was very short-lived because there was very, very little validity to it. And if I remember correctly, one of their biggest things was I can't remember the name of the person that they were claiming, but he had a scar on his head that they said that was consistent with the Zodiac. Now, I don't know about you, but if I fall down the steps today, I might have a scar next week on my forehead that looks very similar. So
you will be arrested.
Yeah. So it's crazy to me some of the theories that come up around this case, because, something as small as that, because they can somehow work the name of this person in the cipher, and he has a scar that could be similar, seem like pretty far out there theories to come to a conclusion and say, we found him. Do you remember whose name that was?
I don't know the individual's name, but he headed up a group called the Case Breakers. And he gathered together 50 people who were former police agents, former FBI, former whatever, law enforcement or whatever, and set about breaking these cases. What it appeared to me is to be a group of people who wanted to be involved in a made-for-TV documentary, or they supposedly solved something like a half a dozen or a dozen different crimes that they knew who was responsible for all these different crimes. And my question was, well, did you really solve it, or do you just have a theory that you want publicized? And with respect to the Zodiac, they said, oh, we know who it is. We know it's this person. And now we want the FBI to do some DNA testing on our person. Well, the question is, well, if you've solved it, then you know it's him, right? Why are you pressing for DNA testing that may or may not be true? So you don't know, you think you know. So don't go around saying, we know that this person is responsible. Plus, with a group of 50 people, do all 50 of the people believe that this person is responsible? Did they take a vote and the majority of them thought he was responsible, and some of them may not think that? It has the feel of a bandwagon of people trying to get on board and be considered an expert on the case and get involved in whatever next television show is available. And the guy who headed up, he did a show on the DB Cooper, the skyjacker.
Yeah.
And he also said the same thing. My group of people, the case breakers, have broken this case. This is who's responsible. Well, he's a guy who has a lot of theories. Whether he has anything to back up the theories, that's another whole story.
Yeah, for sure. And I've got the volume 2 of my book series. I'll be talking about DB Cooper in there because it's on criminals. Volume 2 is. So yeah, I'll be talking about old DB Cooper. So funny. Writing is such a strange thing. Like I often sit back like, who the hell wants to hear about anything that I say? And then of course now I have a podcast. So apparently people want to hear things that I have to say.
Absolutely.
It's funny. So we've talked a whole bunch about all these other documentaries and stuff. You have a whole book series on the Zodiac. So tell us a bunch about that.
Sure. My trilogy came out first in the years 16, 17, and 18. As I dug into the case and read the files, I began to see more and more about the case. Some things that weren't reported very well, some things that were glossed over. And I realized that there wasn't really a clear telling of the case. Just what are the facts of the case? Who did what when? Who was murdered? Who was attacked? What letter came when? What did the letter say? There was nowhere to go to read a good, clear, and accurate description of the case. And so I began to put one together because I thought, there's need for this. I think since Robert Graysmith's book, Zodiac, nobody wanted to take up the challenge to rewrite the book or do another book on the Zodiac because that one was so wildly popular and everybody was familiar with that. But as the years went by, people began to realize that there were errors in Graysmith's book. There were things that weren't mentioned, things that were not really looked at very closely. And in compiling his book, he made it known that he believed that Arthur Lee Allen was responsible for the Zodiac crimes. And so a lot of the information tends to be slanted in that direction. For instance, the Zodiac is really big and scary. He was ferocious. He was terrifying. And so he must be a large person. He must be aggressive. Some of the some of the mythology around serial killers. Somebody begins killing in an area, everybody is scared and they think it must be a big, terrifying person. And then what happens when a serial killer is arrested? They say, oh, he was such a quiet neighbor. I had no idea he was involved in anything like this. He seemed like a very kind man, and I talked to him, and I never would have known. So it makes me think, why do we always look for a big, scary person?
Yeah.
So with that mythology, Robert Graysmith went to great pains to make sure Arthur Lee Allen sounded big and scary and threatening, which is exactly not what we would expect from a serial killer. So as I began to put this book together, I realized I had so much information that one book soon became 2 books and became 3 books worth of material. So my first book, Zodiac, Hunted, the Zodiac Murders, I tell the story of the case in great detail. The attacks, the letters, the victims, the areas that were impacted, but also the public response to the Zodiac and the police response to the different crimes, what the police did. In fact, one person expressed to me the fact that Hunted does a really good job of showing what police procedure was back in the 1960s. And I had no idea that that would be of interest to anybody, but apparently procedures today are very different than they were back in the 1960s. So you can read the book and learn what the police procedures were back then and what they did. And in my opinion, they did a fairly good job for what the time period was. Obviously, they didn't research and investigate the crimes like they would today. Today at a crime scene, it would be roped off and it would be scoured for 48 hours looking for hairs and fibers and trace evidence as well as everything else. Whereas back then they walked around, they looked for shell casings and they looked for footprints. That was about all that they could deal with back then. So after a couple of hours, the crime scene was released back to the public again. So we might look at it and say, what a horrible job of investigating they did. But, for the time they did what was expected, what was necessary. So that's Hunted. My next book is Profiled, and the Zodiac Examined. And in that book, I work to put together a criminal psychological profile of the killer. I do a deep dive in that book on what evidence the Zodiac left behind, trying to categorize it, trying to quantify it, and make reasonable assumptions about who the killer is based on the evidence left behind. The second book is also a compendium on serial killers in general, because I attempt to locate the Zodiac within the different types of serial killers. The FBI has studied serial killers and put them into categories and attempted to understand serial killers. When the Zodiac was killing, even the term serial killer had not been invented. And so obviously when police departments began to look into these crimes that seemed to be linked and somebody was claiming credit for them and it was an ongoing series of crimes, they really didn't know how to understand it. But with hindsight, we can look back on the crimes and say, well, this is what the FBI now understands about serial killers and what that says about the Zodiac, who he was as a person. And I go to great details of looking at all the different evidence and all of the different conclusions that the FBI has come to looking into the phenomenon of the serial killer. And I complete the book with a several pages long criminal psychological profile of the Zodiac. But by the time you get there, you understand why I make the different assertions, because it's based on what the FBI has said and it's based on the evidence of the crime. So it's a deep dive into the evidence of the case. My final book, Exposed, the Zodiac Revealed, I reveal the conclusions of my research. And my research conclusions led me to conclude that the man responsible for the Zodiac crimes was Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Now, it's not a widely held opinion. A lot of people are very critical of that conclusion, but that's what my look into the case concluded.
Interesting. I know It is not one that I included in my book. I wish I would have had it earlier so that I could have done some good research into that, because I'm fascinated. Um, you know, I created a game, right? Because when I started out as a game designer, right? That's my main thing that I do, and I created Killer's the card game. And my most recent game that I released is a game called The Profiler, and that
Huh.
game is a social deduction game where you play as a group, and one person in your group is a killer, and everybody else is part of the townsfolk trying to investigate the crimes that are happening in their town. I created police reports, medical examiner reports, forensic reports. The game is set in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s. So there is no real forensics yet. And there is some decent blood typing and stuff. And actually, we have an expansion for blood typing. But yeah, it was fascinating putting all that stuff together, because that is fascinating to me. Looking in and trying to understand from the crimes where, like, what type of person you're dealing with. And when you start doing that, what you realize is that often many of the categories merge together, right? Not any one of the killers fits any single category, because there is some overlap, and no case is completely the same, right? People come to things for different reasons. They express things differently. One person may decide be a secreter and leave things at the crime scene, physical evidence. Other people do not. Some crimes are sexual in nature. Other ones are not so clearly sexual, right? They may do other things that are still sexually gratifying, but they're not, raping the victim or having sex with the corpse after it's after the demise. So there are all kinds of things that go into it that are just fascinating. So the game itself, I actually got a bunch of information and talked to Catherine Ramsland about it, and got a bunch of stuff from her on crime scene investigation so that I could, like, implement a lot of that stuff into the game. And it's been really kind of cool to put that together. So you're actually able to kind of do some low level investigating and try to figure out what's happening. And yeah, so I think that out of the three would probably be the most fascinating to me. I've got so many books over there about, just understanding the criminal psychology, because I think sometimes, we get this idea that things are very clear cut, and they never are. I worked for some time as a counselor with kids. And so, even though I've met lots and lots of kids that have similar upbringings, similar trauma, they're often always expressed differently, right? They express it. Some of them are very angry. Some of them have outbursts. Some of them are very depressed. And so it really is a case by case situation, understanding why somebody would choose to do something, whether it's robbing a place or murdering a bunch of people. But it's fascinating. And I certainly appreciate all of that research and looking into those things, because the public doesn't really understand that, I think.
Hmm. I have a chapter in one of my books on the myths of the serial killer. What Hollywood will tell you about a serial killer is very different than what they really are, the way they present themselves. In fact, it's almost impossible to make a statement that's a correct statement that starts all serial killers blank, fill in the blank, because all serial killers are white males, except for the ones who aren't.
Yeah.
All serial killers are straight, except the ones who are gay. Serial killers have been found in every socioeconomic status, from among virtually every culture and every ethnic background. So what drives them? What unites them? They are such individuals that there may be nothing that unites all serial killers, but there are commonalities, and there are, as I say, the FBI has attempted to group them into different categories, and many serial killers belong in one or more categories.
Yeah, for sure. I am currently working, and we're on the early stages of working on this book. But my friend EJ Hammond, who was on the last episode with me, suggested that we go and we take, 10 or 20 serial killers. And the whole point of the exercise is to go into their childhood and to look at what happened in their childhood and try to understand what that looked like and how that affected and was expressed in their later life. And is there a correlation between this trauma in their childhood to then becoming the monster that they ultimately were to become? And I think it's going to be fascinating. I think we're going to find some things that we didn't expect, and some things that are not common. And then we're going to find some really, really sick, depraved shit that happened that maybe nobody wanted to find out to begin with. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that goes. And of course, I got I requested to do Albert Fish, and of course, for those of you that know, Albert Fish was a child killer, and he did some really, really depraved things to his victims and to his own family. Really, I mean, he had children and would do things and have them do things to him. And I'm interested to see where all that went wrong and if it really was something that started very early. And what's interesting that most people don't know, his first kill was in my hometown. And so I have some direct connection with old Fish. So I'm interested to see where that little path leads. But yeah, anyway. So with that being said, I'm curious on your take. You've already said that your assertions is that it was Ted Kaczynski. And of course, we know Kaczynski just died not too long ago. What was it, a year or two ago now? He
June
passed
10th
away
of last year.
Okay, yeah. So he had passed away. I've often thought, and this is because of the Unabomber stuff, I've often thought it would be interesting to have a conversation with Kaczynski after he published his manifesto and all of that, to what his opinion would be of the world as we live in it today. And I've always been interested to think, to wonder if he would just look at you and say, "I told you I was right," and then walk off. We should have got rid of all those people a long time ago. But I think he is a fascinating subject. And of course, I know that towards the later years of his life, he really didn't talk to anybody. He didn't answer letters. He was not very communicative, and decided to keep to himself.
So you're referring to the last year or two of his life?
Yeah.
Okay, because soon after he was arrested, he corresponded widely.
Yeah.
I sent him letters, and I corresponded with him for about 2 years. And so I got to know him a little bit before he figured out that I was a Zodiac researcher. Then he didn't want anything to do with me.
Oh, that's funny.
But when he was first incarcerated, he was corresponding with upwards of 400 people.
Yeah, because he wanted to get all of his ideas out there. He finally got them to publish the manifesto and all of that stuff. And so I think that he wanted to correspond with people. And I'm not sure I understand why that stopped at some point.
I know he was diagnosed with cancer and given 2 years to live. And he took his own life after about a year and a half of that. So he was full of cancer. That may have had something to do with his curtailing of communication with people. At one point, he reached out to the New York Times and some other high profile press people and said, I'm willing to give an interview now, but you have to tell me what your thoughts are on the technology problem and whether you agree with me. And I need in written form what your questions for me are going to be. And the people, the reporters who received letters from him just ignored it, just didn't want anything to do with it. Because obviously he wasn't going to give a sincere, no holds barred interview. And so they weren't willing to participate in that.
Yeah, he just wanted to espouse his ideas and his theories so that he could say what he wanted to say. But I mean, when we look at some of these people, that are largely very narcissistic. I mean, that's what they're always trying to do. They're always trying to control the situation. They're always trying to get out what they want to get out. We see it with Gacy. Bundy did it. Dennis Rader did it. They always want to get out their side of it, and they're not interested in actually giving a real story. Bundy certainly didn't, and he gave what he wanted everybody to think it was, so he could get off. But what do you think? When do you think? Do you think that the Zodiac crimes, started with Sherry Joe, or was it before then?
It could have been before that. I don't know for sure. The Sherry Joe Bates murder in October of 1966 is not considered a canonical Zodiac murder. There are many people who think he had absolutely nothing to do with that, including the Riverside Police Department. I believe that he was responsible for the murder and that he wrote the letters following up to that. There is a chance, I believe, that he may not have committed the murder, but that he put together the letters in the follow-up to that. The idea that this woman had been killed by somebody else and he wrote letters claiming credit for it a month later puts him in great jeopardy for being considered a fool if her murderer comes forward or they identify who did it and he's not the one who did it. But to this day, she has not been, the crime has not been solved. So there's no reason not to believe the letter writer who sent the letters in the follow-up to that crime. And that I believe there's enough literary connections to the future Zodiac letters that those are indeed written by the same person. The Zodiac wrote letters in more than one part. He wrote the 3-part letters. And so that would make sense that the confession letters of 1966 were written in 2 different letters that said almost the same thing. So that's my take on it. But the Zodiac in his letters congratulated the police department for tying him to Riverside. So he took credit for it himself. And then he said, but there are a hell of a lot more down there. Well, down there, what does that mean? Southern California? And lo and behold, there are a half a dozen or more additional murders that have not been solved over the years. And any one of these or all of them may have been the responsibility of the Zodiac. Some of them seem to have more of a connection to the Northern California murders. So I can't really say whether the Zodiac did them or not, but it's not above being a possibility.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting, with these kinds of cases specifically, because you never know what to believe because, let's face it, somebody who is going around killing other people is probably not the most honest person, right? And when they're trying to reach out to the police for whatever reason to gain fame or to become infamous, they may not, or they may embellish quite a bit, right? And we know that from Henry Lee Lucas, right? He takes credit for some 600 murders, and we know that there is no possible way that he could have committed those. and many others were committed by other people. And, it's just one of those things that people will, criminals will take credit for other things, whether they've done them or not. And in the book, I cover some of that, the other possible Zodiac murders. But, who's to know if it's the case or not? But there is certainly some real evidence out there that it is not just the canonical murders that he committed. So, and when we look at all of this, I talked to EJ about this last episode, is that there is like the possibility that Bundy started when he was like 12 or 14. And
Yep.
so, we know that many of these people who commit these kinds of crimes will start off much earlier than we know about, because it's almost impossible to just go out there and commit the perfect crime, right? Especially now in the day and age that we live in now. In the 70s and the 60s, like you already mentioned, the investigation is very, very different. And no one is talking to anyone. The police departments are not corresponding with each other. There could be a murder a county over, and nobody has any idea that it could possibly be connected with these 6 other murders that have happened in the next town. And, so there is a vast difference in the understanding of policing back then and what they did, even if they did a good job for what they could have done during the time. It is just so incredibly different now with VICAP and, all of the inner workings of all of the police departments, with a nationwide database, in being able to see these ideas and these patterns that are happening throughout our country. And sadly, it is because of people like the Zodiac, people like Bundy, that have gotten us to a place where our technology has become better and better, and people have decided that we need to come up with these new things. It's one of the reasons why I think it is so important that people get interested in this industry, because without them and without their fascination and their understanding, we never get better technology. We never get better ideas and more better investigative techniques. It takes people being passionate about it to get out there and really, really discover the next thing that is going to be the big thing that's going to change the industry again.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, the ciphers, right? What are your thoughts on all of those?
I think that was one of the things that hooked me on the case. I'm no cipher expert, but when I was a kid, my father and I wrote ciphers to each other and tried to crack them. And we knew nothing about the Zodiac back then, but it was a fun kind of hobby, something that you would pick up in scouting or maybe math class in school. I'm not sure where we came up with the idea. But it's fascinating, and it says something about the Zodiac to be involved in that. What exactly it said is not always clear, but it's fascinating that he sent his first cipher and it was solved over the weekend by a couple of amateurs, putting in a combined total of about 22 hours worth of work. They solved it, turned it into the police, and said, here's the answer to it. What did the Zodiac do in response? Is he said, well, here's a tougher one. Here's another one. The ciphers were presented in such a way as that they were puzzles. When we think of ciphers, we might think of ciphers being used to transport information so that nobody else sees it until it gets to its recipient. Coding used on the internet is when something is encrypted. It's so that I can know what it says, I can send it, and the person that I send it to knows what it says, but everybody in the middle can't interpret it. That wasn't the case with these ciphers. They weren't used as communication codes across enemy territory or whatever. It was the killer writing a code and challenging the viewers to crack it, to interpret it. So it was like a puzzle. You have to solve this puzzle. And when the high school teacher and his wife solved it, along comes another one. Here's one that's a little bit tougher. Solve this one. That's exactly the type of thing that a professor, particularly a math professor, would do with students. Here's a puzzle, solve it. Here's an equation. Can you solve this equation? Well, if the student can solve it, well, here's another one that's a little bit tougher. And when the Zodiac took credit for the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, he said, yes, he congratulated the police department for finding what he called his Riverside activity. But he said, you're only finding the easy ones. Well, what does it mean, easy ones? Are some of his murders less easy than that one? It has the same feel for his cipher. You solved an easy cipher. Here's a tougher one. Well, you solved Sherry Jo Bates. That's an easy one. There are some tougher ones. And he said there are a hell of a lot more down there. Yeah. So it's very fascinating that for some reason his mind went to ciphers. Very few criminals use ciphers in communicating with the police. Dennis Rader is one of a very few people who have ever sent ciphers to the police, but he's not the only one. Those two are not the only ones. And I suspect that that's a reason why many people thought Dennis Rader was responsible for the Zodiac crimes, because, well, he also did ciphers.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting. One of the things that I always try to do is I always try to go back and look at what was going on in the time period for people. And during that time, and I completely agree with you, the ciphers were a puzzle for him. It was a game that he was playing with the people, that he was trying to see who could figure it out, right? But this is also a time in history where, we're not in it like really far into the age of, television. There's a lot of radio still. There's a lot of newspaper still out there. And every week there is the crossword, right? And people would literally during that time sit around the dinner table or the breakfast table usually, and they would solve the crosswords together as a family. And I think that there is a very, very different mindset, a very different analysis, like how people think is very different back then from how people think now, because we've become very reliant on, like, for example, as a kid, my dad taught me how to read a map, right? We could get I grew up right in Wilmington, Delaware. We could get down to Florida, but we didn't have GPS back then, right? So you had to pull out the paper map and you had to figure out, all right, I'm here and we've traveled this far, and how far down the road are we? Is there a left turn here that we can go? But we're so spoiled now as people. We have all of this technology that gives us this instant gratification that we can type it in and it will take us directly where we need to go. That's not dissimilar to this idea of, AI and stuff like that, where we can get our answers or our questions answered immediately. And it's not even by a human, right? But people back then had different critical thinking skills. They were actually using and engaging that. So it's fascinating. Now people would just develop a computer program to solve these ciphers, and they have. There's been plenty of those that have been developed to try to figure these things out. But back then, it was people actually sitting down and working on it and sitting down together and breaking those things. I think it is such a different time in history, and it's fascinating that has changed. And it doesn't mean that people are not as smart. It's just different. And technology has made things different, which has consequently also made crime different. And so we have different aspects of that now too, that we didn't have 60, 70 years ago. So it's fascinating, the whole study.
In some ways, people today are not as smart as people in the past, because today we rely on Google Maps and we rely on the internet. If you have a question, you can just Google it to find out the answer. Back then, you had to put in some critical thinking.
Yeah.
Back then, people were better at solving puzzles and using critical thinking skills. I had a friend who was a couple decades older than me, and he liked to do the daily jumble from the newspaper. And even if he wasn't looking at the jumble, you could just read him the 5 or 6 letters, and he would rearrange them and tell you what word was being spelled. Where I would stare at the letters and try to figure out what the letters were, what order they were in, and I couldn't come up with it. He could do it almost instantly just because he was trained that way. We become too reliant on technology, I'm afraid, sometimes.
For sure. I remember as a kid, I used to, my dad owned a corner store, and my grandfather would open up the store, and we would sit down there in the mornings and we would go through the word searches together. And we would go and, line by line. And there was a very clear method that we would go through to find all of these words and figure out who could find them faster. And so we had this exercise that we did all the time. And then later on, I was terrible at math, and my dad was really, really good at math. And so, they ended up getting me this program, and I forget what it was called. I think I still have it, but it was like a cassette tape program that taught you how to do math backwards. And so for whatever reason, it worked. And I could then, after doing that program, I could do everything in my head. I didn't need to use paper or anything. I could, reverse engineer everything. And it is a skill that has been completely lost on our culture. And, they're, you get called old now if you're like, man, how are y'all going to survive? Like, you can't even figure out simple things. It's amazing how that's changed. But then there's other things that I look at and I can't figure out for the life of me how to download shit to my computer. Sometimes I got to go talk to the kids. Like, how do I do this? Where I got to go? It's amazing. So you mentioned earlier the whole profiling. What do you think were the motivations? Like, why did the Zodiac or Ted, do all of this?
That's a very complicated question. People have tried to simplify it and say, oh, the Zodiac was only out for attention. He wanted newspaper headlines. Well, that was part of it. I think at the root of most serial killers is an anger and a hatred and a need for revenge. Even Ted Kaczynski, in putting together his manifesto and raging against technology, admitted in his private notes that the only motivation behind what he was doing was revenge. It was only revenge. Well, if that's true, then maybe we need to reread the manifesto with a different set of eyes, realizing that, yes, maybe he believed these things, but that wasn't his motive for what he was doing. Kaczynski had a very difficult childhood with respect to alienation. There's some evidence that he dealt with a certain low-level autism. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia with paranoia after he was arrested. And these mental ailments seem to have interrupted his ability to make friendships and relate to other people. On top of that, as a child, he was given an IQ test and measured to have an IQ of 176, which is astronomically high. We're talking not just a PhD professor. We're talking that's a prodigy. That's somebody who is up in the limits of an Einstein. I mean, not simply a genius. He was a super genius. And his teachers talked about his experiences at high school, where he would be making allusions to foreign languages or classical literature and making quoting something or making a joke about something. And the other kids at school just kind of looked at him like they had no idea what he was talking about. He could spout Shakespeare, he could mention Faulkner, he could whatever. He was just so brilliant that people just couldn't relate to him. But because of his intelligence, he skipped 6th grade, went straight from 5th grade to 7th grade. And then in high school, he skipped 11th grade. So he was smaller and younger than all of his classmates. And yet he was still far more intelligent than any of them. And so that, coupled with his autism and his schizophrenia, made it impossible for him to make friends or feel comfortable or feel welcomed by anybody. I get the sense that everybody who met him thought he was kind of a creep and kind of weird and strange, and so they kept their distance from him. Couple that with a lot of bullying that took place as he was a youngster. He was very alone, and he felt very alone. And part of his rage, part of his need to kill other people, was to seek revenge against the world. People were unable to meet his needs as far as getting along with other people. And so that, I believe, also sheds light on his work as the Zodiac. What was the Zodiac's rage against? Well, he killed couples in lovers' lanes areas for the most part. That's how he started out. Well, if you have trouble relating to other people and you feel alienated from other people when you become a young adult or an adult and you can't meet your sexual needs, you have a rage against other people who have that ability. And it must have been extremely frustrating for him to see other people involved in relationships where he wasn't able to get involved. He wasn't able to make friends, let alone become in a dating relationship or a sexual relationship.
Yeah. When we look at that, it's often motivation for many, many different killers, right? This idea that they covet what they can't have. And so they end up striking out against these people that, that they have what they want. And so it's not always just that they go and they rape and kill because they're trying to fulfill that sexual desire, but that they often will kill indiscriminately because they're angry about those things that they feel like they deserve, that they should have, that person should not have. And I think you do. I think you see that in the Zodiac murders. I think that there is an anger at those people, at whoever did it. And I think that specifically, probably Sherry Joe, that he probably knew her, that there was definitely some connection there. It seems like to me that that whether they knew each other, like had any kind, like, for somebody who is schizophrenic, has autism, that is struggling to have these relationships and also having these delusions, somebody could look at them and smile, and they might believe that they now have a relationship, and that there's something there. And then what happens when that person rejects you? How do you react to that? And there are some people that will become very violent because of that. And we see this later on, that maybe that is part of the case. I don't know that for sure, but when you look at those types of crimes, it seems like there could be some correlation there. One of the things that's always been interesting to me about the Zodiac case specifically is that it seems like he didn't use any one method, which often you see people getting into kind of a ritual, right? They do a specific thing. And you don't see that with Zodiac. He uses, guns, knives, rope, and so it's almost different almost every time. Curious your thoughts about that.
It says something about the killer. The Zodiac obviously changed his MO and changed it substantially from attack to attack. MO, modus operandi in Latin, is basically means the way it's done. As you mentioned, serial killers and other types of killers tend to do things a certain way because it works and it makes sense for them. The same reason that You and I may drive to work the same way every day. We get into a pattern, it works, and so we do it. Or we make our breakfast the same way every day. Patterns are something that are familiar to us. MOs can change, and serial killers are known to change MOs because they want to experiment with what will bring more pleasure, or they will find ways to escape detection. They'll think, oh no, I left fingerprints. Well, I'm not going to do that again. I'm going to try something a little bit different so I don't leave fingerprints. Or I struck at this time of day and the sun was still up and somebody may have seen me. I'm going to do it after dark from now on. So changes are possible. With the Zodiac, I don't know any serial killer who is so comfortable in changing his MO from attack to attack. And so that would have to be a description within a profile of the killer, is that he makes great changes from event to event. Some people have said, well, Ted Kaczynski couldn't be the Zodiac because the Zodiac killed with knives and guns, and he killed up close, where the Unabomber killed from a distance and used bombs. The problem with that reasoning, though, is after the murder of Paul Stein, the Zodiac changed the way he was killing, and he said, I'm not going to announce my murders anymore. I'm going to make them look like accidents or killings of rage or some other things. And he also sent bomb diagrams to the press and to the public, saying that this is how I'm going to kill in the future. So the Zodiac himself changed from a killer of guns and knives to a killer who at least threatened with bombs. It's my contention that he didn't have bombs at that time, and it was kind of an idle threat, but it was an idle threat that bothered him. And so he worked on it and thought about it and experimented with it until he could come up with bombs, and he could come through on his threats of using a bomb. I don't know why else somebody who was a math professor would suddenly become a serial bomber. That's never been explained very well, but to my understanding, if there's the intermediate step of being the Zodiac first, it makes a whole lot of sense that he threatened with bombs and was so determined and so humiliated that he couldn't actually use bombs, that he used his skills of being meticulous and his relentless personality, maybe a little bit of OCD in there, to keep working on that until he could in fact use bombs. And that's how he became the Unabomber.
It's fascinating. I think, I think a lot of times it may also be that life circumstances change the capabilities that you have. And, for Kaczynski, we know that, there were lots and lots of life events that happened that caused him to end up out where he ended up. Right. And so now his capability in trying to hide away from society and trying to keep away from all of that, he only had one avenue that he felt like was available to him. And like you said, he already stated that that was the direction he was wanting to go. And now he found himself where he felt safe from the world, but he could still go and interact with it the way that he decided he wanted to interact with it. And, later on that ends up being using bombs to send them through the mail and to kill the strategic people that he wanted to kill. So I think that makes sense, especially after, I think maybe later in life, the motivations became different. I think that there may have been different trauma that happened that caused him to lash out at these types of people versus when he was younger, when sex was much more prominent, as hormones are going and things like that, in your adolescence, going into your 20s and your 30s, as that is often a focus of life at that time, that later on, when more things happen, your focus becomes very different. That's not the thing that's as important anymore. proving a point is much more important. And with someone who is, we know now about autism, one of the things that happens with people on autism is they get stuck on certain things and certain topics, and they obsess over these different things. And I think you can really put a case together that Ted Kaczynski was very obsessive about certain things in his life. And when you hyper focus on those things, they can really, really get out of control. And some people will become violent, other people will become depressed and will hurt themselves. And we see that a lot in our culture now. People that really suffer from anxiety, that struggle with, being on the spectrum, because they have difficulty attaching to other people and developing relationships, will end up very, very depressed. And sometimes they end up self-harming because they can't deal with it any other way. And it really has become an epidemic within the youth of our culture that are really struggling with those issues. And I know one of the things that I've always tried to do is trying to figure out ways to help them relate to the world better, because it is such an important part. We are social beings, and whenever we end up outside of society and by ourselves, nothing ever good comes out of that. Loners often end up struggling with all kinds of different identity issues and things because they're not feeding that need that they have to be social people. Even the most socially adverse people still need some kind of community. They find it in different ways, but we all need community. We all need other people. We can't live in a vacuum. It doesn't work, which is always fascinating to me. And then when you look at Kaczynski, living out in a shack by himself, away from everyone, breeds the inability to fight off these or distract yourself from these thoughts that are constantly coming into your mind. And you have no method of dealing with the obsession that's happening, and no one else to tell you, hey, maybe it's not a good idea to feel this way or to be doing this. You have nobody to bounce ideas off of, so you end up in your own bullshit, and you can never get out of that. It becomes a terrible prison to live in.
Yes. During the 1980s, when Ted Kaczynski was living in a cabin in Lincoln, Montana, he corresponded with his brother, who was living in Texas for much of that era. And David Kaczynski later came to the conclusion that the letters that he was exchanging with Ted was the only outside information that Ted was receiving at the time, that it was his one lifeline to the outside world. And that wasn't much of a lifeline to get a letter every week or two or month or two or however often it was. A second point, when we think of the Unabomber, we think of the arrest of Ted Kaczynski when he was hauled out of his cabin and taken in handcuffs to the police department. He was 53 at that time, almost 54. And so that's the kind of the picture we have of the Unabomber. But Ted Kaczynski, when Sherry Jo Bates was murdered, he was 24 years of age. And when the bulk of the Zodiac murders took place, he was 27 years old. So as you say, it was a very different time period in his life. He was dealing with very different challenges than he was, obviously, when he was in his 50s. The FBI, who knows a lot about serial killers, had profiles on the Unabomber, and they expected him to be about 40 years of age. That's what they plugged him as. They were kind of surprised that he was almost 54 when he was arrested. And the question is, how did he become a serial killer later in life? Because most serial killers begin their killing between the ages of 18 and 25. If Ted Kaczynski was only the Unabomber, he became the Unabomber when he was almost 40 years of age. He became a serial killer at that time. How can you account for that? And what was he doing in the meantime? the Zodiac activity would explain that gap in time.
Yeah, that's that is definitely a point there. You know, we know that that's the case. We know that there is always, for these different killers, there is, you know, they're testing things out. They're seeing what they can do, and trying to experience these things, because often most of them don't feel the same way that other people do. And they're trying to seek out that thing, you know, what is most pleasurable, and how do I achieve that? You know, other people have these moments where they enjoy it and I don't enjoy anything. So how do I get to that place? And they start testing and playing around with these different ideas. Um, you know, Dennis Rader, an interesting example of that. You know, he was in doing all of these, you know, all this BDSM and stuff like that, and building and building and building to this place. Same thing with Golden State, who you mentioned earlier. This is a guy who was, you know, he was raped 300 plus women. He started doing that, long stalking, and you know, stalking women for a long time, and then eventually he stepped up to starting to rape them, and then at some point he decided he needed to go a little bit further, and he starts killing them. And so you see this progression that happens, and this need to go a little bit further and a little bit further. Kemper is another good example of that. He talks about in a bunch of his interviews that he started out, you know, just picking them up and driving them around, and then he would bring a knife with him, and he would have that knife, and just to see if he could have it, and then he would bring a gun, and then he would decide to, you know, the gun would be unloaded, but then he would load it just to see, and then he could kill. And I think it's interesting that, you know, he talks about one time he locked the gun in the trunk, and he had the girl open the trunk for him so he could get the gun out and kill her. And it's fascinating when you get that honesty from someone who has killed that many people, and you really get an insight. And I feel like Kemper is fairly unique in that, where he was very honest about his motivations and the reason why he did things and how he did them. And you really get this insight into his mind and understanding the type of killer that he is. He's a fascinating subject. So,
Jeffrey Dahmer was also very forthcoming once he was arrested.
Yeah.
He came across as being very authentic and honest about who he was and what he was doing. Unlike some others like Ted Bundy, who lied until his dying days.
Yeah.
Always trying to get one over on somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting, which is, again, why it's a case by case situation, because these people are so vastly different, even though they've all killed people. The way they got to it, the process that they went through to ultimately get to that, their conclusion is different. And it's different for all of us, you know, finding who we are, coming into our adulthood, and finding whatever monicum of success that we have later on is different for each and every person. And why we would ever expect it to follow the same path is ridiculous, because nobody follows the same exact path. We're all different, and it has to be taken that way. So with that, yeah, Zodiac, I've often said, and of course that this may never be the case, but I've often said to people, you know, that are asking me about Zodiac and who I think it is, and I often tell them that unless somebody wakes up one night and goes into their attic and finds the hood somewhere, we're never going to know for sure. And I think that is, you know, not true, because, like you mentioned earlier, forensics changes things. And I think that, you know, there are investigative techniques, technologies that will come out that will be far superior to what we have now, which is unbelievable what they can do now and you know, the reason why we see such a decrease in serial killing is because of those efforts.
Exactly.
Because there are lots and lots of people that they may be a serial killer if they had opportunity and time. Well, the way that forensics are now, most of them don't have time. They may have opportunity to start out, but they don't have the time to continue to go on and on and on for 30 or 40 murders before they get caught. There's just so much evidence that you can leave behind that they can now identify and directly tie you to it. So I think that barring like misconduct somewhere, I think it's going to be very hard pressed to see people like Zodiac or like Bundy, Dahmer in the future. But what we do see is an incredible rise in mass shootings that have happened in the last 10, 15 years because people still feel the same way. They still want and have this desire to harm other people for whatever purposes they have, but they know that they can't get away with it like they once did. They know that it's not possible to stalk and kill individual people. And so they go and, take out whole groups of people that they feel that they need to do. And I think the psychology now is very different because things have changed. Not that there weren't always mass killings, because there always have been, but I think the rise and the propensity of it is directly related to the change in our own culture.
That's interesting. I always thought it was a change in psychology, but I think you're right. Now that I think about it, is that a change in technology has led to that.
Well,
the prevalence of ring cameras and all the other forensic evidence that can be collected probably works on people's psyche to realize they can't get away with it.
Yeah, I think it's not to completely dive into other things, but one of the things that I've been personally a proponent of is, I and I struggle to say this because it's a hot button topic, but I love video games. We have a whole generation of people that have grown up disconnected from the rest of the world that we live in, that spend largely all of their time online and constantly in this virtual world, right? Even us right now are on StreamYard, and we're not here physically together, which means that I don't have the same interaction with you as I would if we were sitting at a dinner table right across from one another. The psychology is completely different. And you have these kids that are growing up with no connection with other people. And then they are inundated with first person shooters where they are killing all of their friends with no connection at all to that. They respawn, they come back. And I think at some point, I would love to see somebody do a study and see the correlation. Now, I will tell you this too. I don't believe that video games or other things are any cause of any of that stuff. However, I believe it is a contributing factor to why people can go into a school and shoot 30 of their friends and not think twice about it until it's over and they realize, oh shit, this is real life. And that is different. Yeah, I think it's fascinating that we now live in an age where that is the case. And I feel like there's a direct correlation between the two.
Interesting. I've never studied that in depth, but in today's society, it certainly needs to be studied.
Yeah, I think it would be worthwhile. I think we would find a lot of things. And like I said, I don't think that there is any one thing that is cause for anything like that. I think it is a collection of things. It's trauma, it's anxiety and depression and everything that goes together. And this very antisocial world that we live in, because the world has drastically changed. I watch people that, they may, just like Kaczynski, only interact with people once or twice a week, a day, whereas it used to be that as kids, you go out and you play with the friends in the neighborhood. You're out from sun up to sundown. Everybody's out in the woods building a fort and hanging out, and that is not what happens in our society. And we wonder why people are so disconnected and why we have this rise of all of these things that are directly related to people's disconnection with humanity. We don't have the same, it's not, oh man, I can't do that because I might hurt the guy that lives next door. We don't give a shit about the guy next door because we have zero connection to the guy next door. So it's interesting to me. I love a good bit of sociology.
I agree that it's rather reductionistic to just say it's the presence of video games that's causing that, because there are quite a few factors involved. I would suggest that the breakdown of the family is another major factor, probably more crucial than the rise of video games.
Yeah, and you look at that and you think, the family now, you have two. You have to have both family members out there working, mom and dad, working sometimes 1, 2, 3 jobs to pay for everything that's going on. And you have a kid that sits at home and, if they're not in school, they're at home on the computer, on the internet, on their phone, and there is no direct interaction between the family. And often when parents get home, they're tired and they're angry and they're stressed out. And then there is no real warm connections between the family. And so, it's not like back in the day when, you get home from school, mom's there to cook you dinner and hang out and, take care of you. The life that we lead now is very different. And I think the culture around us shows the fruits of that labor. And how do we combat that? Your guess is as good as mine. I think there's a lot of changes that need to happen, but it's very, very difficult in the world in which we live in.
I grew up in a household where we had family dinner every night. We all sat around the dining room table and talk and interact and share with what was going on in our day and what was going on in our lives. And we worked together. We were there for each other. I think that's gone by the wayside for many families.
Yeah. What's always amazing to me is when you actually sit down with your family, typically now, Thanksgiving, Christmas, right, are about the only times you see the rest of your family. And you sit there and what do you talk about around the table when everybody's eating? You don't talk about, well, I mean, some people, I guess, do. Some people are watching football and everything. But often what families talk about are what they did as kids, right? They talk about all the old memories, the good things, the things that they loved, the arguments that they had, and how stupid they are now. And if you really have divisive people in the family, they talk about those same arguments, and then they beat the shit out of each other, and the police get called and they come. So, which is funny because when you watch, which is a good barometer for our culture, when you watch sitcoms, what do they talk about, right? When you watch these different shows about, especially comedy, because that is what they're playing off of, right? They're using real life examples and, distorting them to be funny or to engage with people. But it is true, right? When you watch, even though Saturday Night Live is, whatever it is now, but it's still a good barometer to see what it is that people are really experiencing in life, even if it is at an exaggerated level. So anyway, so the new book, Obsessed,
Yes.
right? That just came out.
Just published. This the photograph was taken just feet away from where Brian and Cecilia were attacked at Lake Berryessa. This photograph was taken by a friend of mine. Following the publication of my Zodiac Serial Killer trilogy, a lot of people have asked me things like, well, how did you get into the Zodiac? How did you first get into it, and how obsessed are you with it, and what are all the things that you did? Because my trilogy is based on information. It's data driven and fact based. So obsessed is my response to a lot of people's questioning of me. It's my memoir of being a Zodiac hunter. So I talk a lot about the fascinating people that I met along the way, the extent that I went to gather information, including corresponding with Ted Kaczynski. One of the big reveals in this book is the fact that in 2011, the FBI, federal government, decided to sell Ted Kaczynski's property because he was sentenced to life behind bars, and all his appeals had been extinguished. They auctioned off of his property so that they could give some money to the victims and the families of the victims. They were awarded money at trial, but Kaczynski was a pauper, so he was never able to provide any money. I purchased the Ted Kaczynski's cabin library at auction. So I have in my possession 240 or more books of his.
Wow.
And that's been really interesting as far as continuing the research. I remember 20 years ago, soon after Kaczynski was arrested, that they published online a list of all of the books in his library. And I thought it'd be kind of cool to go out and look for all of these books and compile a mirror image of his library just to see what he was reading. I had no idea that someday I would have in my possession the exact books that were in that cabin.
Wow, that's crazy.
But it's been fascinating to be able to look at the books and find a lot of marginalia, words that he wrote in the margins of the books as he was reading. He would disagree with something, or he would agree with something, or he would have an additional note of an additional bit of information, and he would add this. So it was very interesting to me to find out what he was thinking about and what he was adding to these books. He underlined a lot of pages. He dog-eared some of the corners of pages because he wanted those pages to be available to him on future reference. So it was really helpful for me to get into his mindset.
I know there used to be a running joke when I was in college that they used to say that I should take stock in a highlighter company because I would use different colored highlighters in all of my books, and there would be complete pages that would be highlighted that I wanted to go back and remember. And you often see that with people that are very, very intelligent, that they end up writing things in the margins and stuff. That was one of the things I was going to ask you if that was the case, because I was interested to know if he had done that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, there's no highlighting that I can recall. That was probably technology before he was arrested. But I did notice similarities between some of the words in the margins and Zodiac letters.
Interesting.
For instance, the phrase 10 shots fired, which is in one of the Zodiac's letters, is word for word in a margin of Kaczynski's writing. And other phrases were similar but not worded exactly the same, but appeared to show a similar mindset.
Wow, that's for the research that you've done, having that is just that is an incredible resource that how many people would even think to look in there and to discover some of that stuff, and have the capability to do that, to be able to really look at the letters that were written to the police, and then to be able to correspond those with Kaczynski's actual writings. And this is from a time, we're not talking about books that were like in his prison cell, right? We're talking about books that were actually in the cabin when he was doing all of his own research and all of his own studies and really getting out all of the things that were in his mind. That is incredible to be able to look at that and really get that insight into who he was and how he thought and his experience of life is yeah, that's unique for sure.
Yeah, some of the books went all the way back to his childhood. They had family members' names in them, or went back to his years at Harvard. Some of his textbooks were included, and also some used books that he picked up while he was in Montana.
Wow, that's really cool.
Yeah,
Now they have the cabin still, right?
correct.
It's at the FBI museum or whatever that is. Actually, I tried to get in there because I wanted to go see it.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I would love to do that. I think it was on display at a place called the Museum for a while, which was a museum of news reporters or something. I'm not exactly sure what it was, but it has been transferred to an FBI museum.
Yeah.
And apparently you can see it in Washington, D.C. if you know where to go to look for it. But
yeah,
I haven't been able to do that.
Yeah, I contacted one of the congressmen, to try to get an invite, because you have to get an invite to go in there to the FBI museum. And I sent out a couple messages and I never did get anything back. I think that you have to do it months and months ahead of time. And I think I didn't have enough time. I think I only did it like 6 weeks ahead of time or something. And so I never did get a response. But eventually I would love to go and see that and just understand it and be in that place. And I think that I'm sure that they have a lot of fascinating stuff there. You know, you wonder if they've got JFK's high heel or J. Edgar Hoover's high heels there.
We had to go there together, Jeff. That'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, for sure. That would be incredible. We'll have to start working on hitting up the Congress people to get some tickets. I'm actually going to be, I will actually be in Baltimore in a couple weeks. Of course, now it's too late to I should have thought about it earlier, because I'm going to be in Baltimore for a show. I could have jumped over to Washington, D.C. and checked that out. That would have been really cool. The things I don't think about. All right. So we've been going almost 2 hours now. We're about 10 minutes shy of 2 hours. So is there anything else you want to add?
I wanted to talk about my trilogy and my new book, Obsessed. They are fantastic reads. They're very well written and even better edited by my publisher.
Well, I'll tell you what. Here's something for all of you out there listening that is fascinating. When you end up writing, and you get picked up by a publisher, and you have all these editors, and these editors, like, they don't necessarily know you, right? These are people that the publishers are hiring to edit your stuff. And I know when I submitted my book, I thought, holy shit, man, they're gonna like hammer me. Like, the editing, I don't even know what's going to come back. And I remember being really freaked out about, like, oh my God, what are they going to say? Am I going to have to change like whole chapters? You're going to have to edit this. When I got my edits back, it was unbelievable to me. Like 7 out of 10 of them were all positive. They were like, oh my God, this is great. I love this. I'm glad you used this. Most of my edits were like, hey, you have to capitalize, this in this sentence. Or if you're going to use a date, make sure that you use it consistently throughout the entire book. Don't change it up. It was mainly that. The only one that I did get hit with is in the chapter when I was writing about Dahmer. One of the parts I talk about how Dahmer did not just kill ethnic people. And Dahmer killed what he found attractive, right? And he happened to find African-American men very attractive. And ethnic men very attractive. But it was not his sole reason, like, because there are a lot of people that have postulated that Dahmer was racist or was trying to eradicate people of color. That is not true at all. Actually, the opposite is true. Those were the people that he loved. Of course, his idea of love was very, very skewed, but this is a guy that was not doing it for that reason. And they did hit me with that. They were like, hey, be careful of the racial stuff. And I had to go in there and work that a little bit. And really, when it came out, I ended up not changing very much. It was just like a sentence that, seemed to be a little bit more pointed than it needed to be. And so, it's fascinating going through that process. Matter of fact, in my book, The Final Thoughts in there, I really get up on my soapbox about the horror community and the gaming community. And I really thought my editors were going to cut that out and just like, you can't put that in the book. And I was shocked that they kept it in its entirety. And I get very much on my soapbox about telling people they're full of shit because I disagree completely with the way that they approach things. Because I think that, like we were mentioning before, I think watching a movie about a fictional killer is far more dangerous than actually knowing the history of the real people and the real victims. I think there is a desensitizing that happens that causes far more problems, even though the majority of those killers, Jason and Freddy and, Ghostface and all this stuff are all based off of real people. And if we knew the real circumstances, it would be far more effective at helping us understand the world around us rather than just enjoying some guilty pleasure that desensitizes us to the real murders that happen around us. And so I talk a bit about that, but it's just fascinating to me that there are a lot of people within the horror community that really, really dislike true crime. And it just boggles my mind because all of that stuff is based on it. Like, and they're just like, oh, I could never watch that. I could never do this. And I'm like, that seems really strange to me because you would think it would be the opposite. I mean, I love horror movies too. Like I grew up on Halloween and, I love a good cheesy indie horror movie. I've got lots of friends that are directors and producers and, it's, I think it's amazing. But to snub one group of people and demonize them because of what they enjoy, that I feel like is far healthier than the opposite is crazy to me.
That's interesting. I have a difficult time with crime drama simply because I know so much about serial killers that I get frustrated that the show is only as good as the writer. And if the writer doesn't know about serial killers, they'll put together a criminal who couldn't function that way. That's not the way serial killers act, and that's not what motivates them. And so I guess I see through the drama too quickly. Where I find most true crime is as horrible and as threatening as any horror that you could put together and that you could imagine.
Yeah, for sure. There's a movie out right now, and I know the director, and it's there's all this gore and everything. And to be perfectly honest, I will probably go see it before the end of the week. But it's just amazing that the way that people respond to that, but have this idea that the real crimes are they're unpalatable. Well, they should be. And to be honest, that one of the reasons why I created Killers the card game, right, is because I wanted it to be honest. I wanted people to understand the horror that actually happens in the world that we live in. And I wanted people to be able to step in to the mindset and to understand these people a little bit better, because I think that it is important that we walk in other people's shoes, even if it is in a very controlled environment. I think to really understand things, I don't think there's any other way to do it but that. And so, I love psychology. It's fascinating. All right. Mark, thank you so much for joining us and for giving us all that stuff. It's really cool. I'm interested to check everything out. For all of you that haven't gotten a chance, make sure you go and check out Dr. Mark Hewitt's books, the Zodiac series that he's done, and his new book, Obsessed. I will put the website and stuff and links down below. And I'm sure that we will talk more. And I am completely down to take that trip to Washington and go see old Ted's cabin. I think that'd be amazing. Oh, one of the things I wanted to say earlier, because you mentioned his brother, is, of course, consequently, the reason why Ted was even caught was because of his brother.
Not precisely. His brother didn't have a clue. It was actually his sister-in-law, who he had never met.
Really?
His sister-in-law recognized some of the wording from letters that Ted had sent to his brother and his mother.
Oh, okay.
And
his brother's wife.
His brother's wife. And she was able to alert her husband, David Kaczynski, and David thought it was a ridiculous idea. And it was only from her perseverance to encourage her husband to look more closely at Ted's letters and the manifesto that they began to realize that, yes, it was one and the same person.
Wow, that's fascinating. I didn't know. I always thought it was the brother that had recognized it.
She's the real hero in the case. If it weren't for her, he may never have been discovered.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you, that gives you something. They always say that women are right. And at least in that case, it's true. I got to tell you, I have experienced that quite a bit, and I've been wrong very often. So cool. Well,
thank you very much for having me, Jeff. I really enjoyed hanging out with you.
Absolutely. Thank you for taking the time, and I will definitely talk to you soon.
Okay. Take care.
All right. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of True Crime, Myths, Legends, and More. We will be back at you in about 2 weeks with another episode. We've got all kinds of stuff planned for you, whether it is, the alternative theories and the otherwise unknown things about true crime and paranormal and cryptids. We'll be back at you with that. So thanks for joining us. Make sure you like, share, comment on all of this. Press that subscribe button down there and make sure you get all of our updates for upcoming shows and future things that we're doing. We're going to do some lives and things where you guys can jump in and talk to me and prove that I don't know anything about what I'm talking about. And that'll be great because that's always fun. So anyway, I will see you guys in a couple weeks. Like and subscribe.